I have fed Bigfoot for 40 years. I admitted that aloud only a handful of times to a few people whose faces I could read well enough to trust, and the weight of that admission sat on my chest like cold river stone for decades. My name is Daniel Harper. I am 69 years old, and I spent 42 years as a forest ranger in the Kettle Ridge district, a long, narrow swath of cedars and firs that hugs the old river basin where the fog climbs slow and thick. It began in the spring of 1984 when I was new to the job, younger than most of the trees I patrolled. And it ended the year my daughter opened her bedroom door and found a stranger, taller than a man, sitting on her windowsill staring into the moonlight. I will tell this story exactly as it happened, with the dates, the smells, the mistakes, and the things I could not undo, because what I learned in those 40 years will change what you think you know about territory, trust, and what it means to cross the line between human and other. The first morning I met it, the air was cold and tasted of damp wood and smoke miles away. The moss under my boots released a sour sweetness, and the low clouds made the canopy hum with the weight of water. I was on a routine check of an illegal trail when I saw prints that did not belong to any creature I had learned to name. They were elongated and wide, deeper at the heel, the nails like short, blunt crescents, and they led in a deliberate path that suggested a creature that could balance on two legs and also use all fours when convenient. I photographed them, I took notes, and I pressed gypsums to the mud to make a cast like we were taught in a forensics class I had once attended at the Ranger Academy. I placed a small rock near the cast to show scale, and I remember the cold creeping into my fingers as if the cast itself had stolen heat from my palms. There was a stillness after that, a silence that felt like a held breath. Then I heard a sound like a throat clearing of the forest, a low vocalization that was not any animal call I knew. I stepped back, raised my hands to show I was not a threat, and the figure moved between the trunks with surprising deliberation. Its fur was the color of wet bark and old coffee. Its shoulders were broad in a way that my training say, "Stay away," but its eyes were not wild. They were patient and very old. I did not run. I did not reach for my radio. I stood and watched until it turned its head, sniffed the air, and walked away as if the trail belonged to both of us. That night, I could not stop thinking about those eyes. I went back the next morning with scraps of food in my pack because curiosity had wrapped itself around me like the morning mist. What started as duty tugged my hand toward tenderness in small, careful ways. Over the first months, I learned habits and rhythms. The creature came and went at times that matched the wind and the sun, and sometimes the phase of the moon. It took offerings in the open without touching the human hands that placed them, leaving instead small tokens in return. A feather woven with moss, a carved twig, a line of pebbles arranged like punctuation. I kept those tokens in a drawer at the ranger station for years until my shift supervisor, Miguel Santos, asked one winter night why my hands smelled of sap and why I kept glancing at the cedar wood like a man seeing an old lover. I told Miguel I had a bad habit of bringing home work, and he laughed, but he was the first of many names to become important in this story. Miguel Santos, friend and fellow ranger, who would later help me hide tracks from people who did not care for mysteries. I will name others as this goes on, because these are not just things that happened to a lone man and a strange creature. There was my friend Bill Carter, who once left a thermos of coffee at a clearing and later swore the steam rose in the shape of a hand. There was Sheriff Tom Walker, who was skeptical until he had to explain to a grieving family why their gate had been torn from its posts. There was Dr. Lena Ortiz, an anthropologist from the State University, who examined my casts and asked careful questions that made me sweat. There was Roy Lang, a hunter who called what lived in the woods a beast and who would be at the center of a violence I tried to prevent. There was my wife Ruth, patient and brave in ways I never thanked her for, and my daughter Emily, who, in time, would change everything by opening a door. Before I go deeper into what I saw and what I did, I need to say what brought me to this forest as a young man and how my past braided with my choices. I grew up in a town that sat on the edge of the timberline, where everyone learned the language of wood smoke and river ice. My father taught me how to read tracks before he taught me how to read a ledger. He died when I was 12 in an industrial accident at the mill, and the grief of that season made me swear to a promise I did not say out loud. Never let the land take someone without me trying to stop it. That promise was a soft, stubborn sort of compass that led me into conservation work and kept me on time. Patrols long after most of my peers moved to offices. I slept in cabins that smelled of dried meat and kerosene. I learned to like coffee made thin and bitter, and to love the sound a mouse makes when it finds a crumb on a floorboard. I joined the Ranger Service because it offered a reason to wake before dawn and a place where small acts of kindness mattered. The backstory of my life in the forest is not a neat paragraph, but a weathered map of losses and vows. I had a brother who left town when he was 22 and never came back. I had a mentor named Old Jack who showed me how to mend a trap and how to fold a map so its creases told a story. I had a wife who forgave my absences and a daughter who drew wolves as birthday gifts. These things shaped how I met the creature, with the caution of a man who had buried more than one memory under a rock, and with the need to repair what the world breaks. People like Miguel, Bill, Tom, Lena, Roy, Ruth, and Old Jack would later force choices that were not only personal, but legal and moral. The first real conversation I had that felt like language was not spoken in words. It happened over the course of a week when I left food at the base of a cedar stump and returned to find it arranged as if eaten in coarse, small bites taken with the rhythm of someone who knew manners. I began to speak to it as if it could understand the contour of language, even when it could not form sounds we used. I said, "I am not here to hurt you." It replied with a low humming that vibrated through the soles of my boots, a sound like a stone rolling slowly in a river. I learned to mimic breaths and soft clicks, until once, in a moonless night, it tilted its head, stepped forward, and put its hand on my wrist. Its palm was warm and rough, calloused not like a human hand, but marked by a life that used claws and branches as tools. We had an exchange of sorts. I offered cooked meat. It offered a sinew braided with lichen. Over the years, those exchanges multiplied and grew into ritual. There are scenes I remember with the clarity of film and with the depth of sound. In the clearing beyond the old logging road, the light slanted like a sheet of glass at dawn. The moss smelled like wet wool and tin. The animal, taller than any bear I had tracked, moved with the economy of someone carrying centuries of knowing in their shoulders. I had to expand those moments into dialogue because each interaction became a negotiation between fear and trust. We spoke as much with objects as with sounds. In a later scene, when the creature stepped into the sunlight and made a sound that matched the rise of the wind, I replied, "You do not need to be afraid here." And it tapped the ground twice with a large finger and pressed a pebble into my palm as if promising it would remember me. The narrative would later demand that I show more than one kind of exchange, so I kept notes, I recorded vocalizations with a handheld device, and I took more casts. The technical procedure I used for casts followed a simple protocol taught in evidence workshops but adapted for the field. I cleaned the print area with a soft brush, measured length and width with calipers, photographed from 3 angles with a scale marker, and mixed plaster of Paris in a wooden container, pouring slowly to avoid air pockets until the cast set. I always labeled each sample with date, GPS coordinates, and weather conditions to preserve chain of custody and context. Those notes would later be examined by Dr. Lena Ortiz and others who tried to fit our phenomena into scientific categories. The first time things sharpened into danger was the night Roy Lang and his father came through the boundary hunting illegally. I found spent shells near a tree line and followed them to a den I had assumed was unused. There were tufts of dark hair and a torn blanket, and then the scent of blood. I called Sheriff Tom Walker, and we tracked small hoof prints and drag marks into a thicket where Roy stood with his gun lowered, shaking. He said, "It moved like a man, but it smelled like hell," and his voice was flat, raw. I asked, "Did you shoot?" He said, "Not at first, but it screamed, and my boy fired, and the sound echoed like a church bell." We argued on the ridge, words sharp like file teeth. Tom said we had to turn Roy in. Roy said he was protecting his family. Miguel tried to mediate. Bill, who had found Roy at the edge of town earlier, put his hand on my shoulder and said, "Daniel, you cannot keep covering for something that cuts people." And it was the first time I felt how my secrecy had become an act that endangered others. This was the beginning of the escalation that would culminate in the worst night of my life. The creature had a history, I discovered, that was not all mystery and magic, but trauma. We found remnants of traps in a back ravine where old logging companies once used strapping devices meant for coyotes. I found scars on the creature from wire and fire. I found a fragment of a metal tag that suggested someone had once tried to catalog or brand it. In an old clipping from the county archive, I found a photograph from 1952 of a man standing next to a fenced area, a blurriness in the film that, when enhanced, looked like a figure smaller than the one I knew, but similar in posture. The revelation that the creature and perhaps its kin had been pursued and experimented on in earlier decades hurt like a physical thing. It explained its mistrust and its habit of avoiding certain valleys. It also explained why it sometimes brought gifts that were human-made objects, like a small rusted tin or a button cracked at the edge, as if to show me the pieces of its story. The middle of this account is thick with meetings, with a slow building of trust, with small happy exchanges, and then with the intrusion of human violence. There were scenes where the creature came into my life in almost human ways. It learned to wait when I was late with food. It came to the ranger station and sat outside while I filed reports, watching me through the rain. One afternoon, it followed my daughter Emily from the edge of the yard to the old willow and watched her draw with a stub of charcoal. She saw it and did not scream. She stood very still, then left the charcoal and walked toward it, small and brave in a way I had inherited somewhere. She sat on a stone, and I remember the smell of her hair like citrus and laundry soap when she leaned toward the creature. They did not speak with words, but Emily began leaving a small bag of cookies on the porch step. She would say later, "Daddy, it sat on the step like an old man listening, and its breath made a sound like wind in a pipe." That image became important because it made my secret less mine to hold alone. The creature protected Emily in subtle ways. Once, when I feared for her, I found a pile of cedar boughs near the fence that would have made a good hiding place for a child. Another time, when a pack of coyotes prowled too close, the creature stood at the ridge and vocalized so low the birds froze and the coyotes retreated. These protections were not always clean or appreciated by others. Tension rose when footage taken by a teenager named Sam at the edge of a pond went viral online with speculation and insults. Some people wanted capture, some wanted trophies, some wanted answers. I found myself in meetings with Sheriff Tom, field officers, and Dr. Lena Ortiz, who argued for a study that would remove the animal to a protected facility for observation. Lena said, "You cannot do science with observation." And I said, "You cannot remove a life from its place without asking if it can return." We argued for hours, and the arguments were full of the vocabulary of policy and ethics and not enough of empathy. The second major moment of tension came when the creature came too close to a hunting camp. I was on patrol when I smelled smoke and bacon and cheap whiskey, and at first I thought it was a family. cookout until I saw a trap without a permit and a gate that matched the rub marks we had been finding near young trees. I confronted the hunters. I said, "You need permission to be here," and their leader spat and called the woods hollow. He said, "We take what the woods give," and he cocked a rifle near his knee. I remember the smell of his sweat like old paper, the metallic taste in my mouth, the crunch of gravel underfoot, and the sudden low hum rising from the trees like a warning. The hunters laughed until the creature stepped into the clearing and sat upright, tall and imposing. There were exchanges of shouted words, then a gunshot that ricocheted and embedded in a cedar post. The creature moved so quickly it blurred at the edges, and one of the young hunters fell down on his face as if pulled by a string. In the chaos, someone tried to aim at the creature, and a wider firefight began. I ran between the bodies, pulling people to cover, yelling for them to stop. Miguel hit the ground and yelled, "Stop, you fools! Do you see what we have here?" Bill pushed a hunter away from firing, and his face was white with terror. That scene was brutal and carved itself into me. That night, a girl named Sarah, a volunteer from a neighboring town who often left food at the old well, was hit by shrapnel and bled. I wrapped her arm with my sleeve and promised, "I will take you to the hospital." She said, "I thought it was a man at first, and I did not know how to be brave." Those 3 paragraphs of tension were full of sensory detail and names because the story demanded human faces to show the cost. The worst escalation came months later when Roy Lang figured out a den entrance and set a mechanical device that would not just trap but harm. I found the device partly armed and confronted him. There was a dialogue that became a litany of accusation, pleading, and menace, with at least 10 quick exchanges between us over the ground that smelled of oil and old earth. He said, "That thing killed my calf," and I said, "You do not know it did." And he said, "I saw it by the fence." And I said, "You shot first and asked later." And he said, "It has no right." And I cried, "Who gives us the right?" The device went off anyway, with a scream like metal and flesh, and the forest answered with a long keening. That night, the creature limped, carrying a wound that smelled of copper and salt. I dressed its wound with cloth and a hot compress because there was no one else. The creature hissed in a way that matched a sob. I sat with it, and I promised I would do something. The confrontation with humans peaked when I decided to intervene legally, to report Roy, to ask the sheriff to press charges. The town split. Some supported protection, some wanted culling. The debate turned ugly in the diner and in the town hall where people shouted and the smell of burnt coffee and anger filled the air. In one of those meetings, Sheriff Tom said in a low voice, "We will not have blood in our streets because of a legend." And I said, "It's not a legend." And Miguel said, "We do not have proof." And Lena said, "Evidence must be gathered." The bureaucratic morass meant nothing to the creature bleeding in my care. I knew I had to protect it in ways the law did not. It is in this part of the story that the title of this piece becomes literal and unbearable. After years of secret offerings and careful footprints and rituals, on a night when Emily was 13, she woke up and saw something in her room. I woke to her scream and to the crash of a screen being pushed out of a frame. I ran down the hall and opened her door to find a figure sitting on her windowsill with its hand on the sill and its eyes fixed on Emily. It had staggered into our yard, attracted by the scent of cookies and a child's room. Emily was shaking but steady, and she said, "Hello, I thought you were outside." And the creature turned its head, and for a moment my brain refused to name what it was seeing. I yelled, get back now!" But my voice sounded small and ridiculous. The creature looked at me with a kind of exhaustion, and for the first time I saw the depth of loneliness in it. It had come into my home to look at my daughter because somewhere in its head the idea of home had become attached to our porch. I spoke in a rush of 10 exchanges with it, and with Emily and with Ruth, who appeared at the doorway with a lamp and a face I could not read. Ruth said, "Daniel, call the sheriff now." And I said, "Not yet." And Emily said softly, "It kissed my hand like a bird." And the creature made a sound that matched the sound of our silence. There was no time to plan. We moved it out gently to the lawn and left the door cracked. In the morning, there were footprints leading away and a thin strip of hair on the sill like a braid of night. The event shattered our private code. I could no longer pretend that what I did was only mine. The town learned, Roy learned, the hunters learned. The worst came when someone left a camera rigged with traps at the edge of our property and posted a video online showing a shadow too tall for a man and the angle of a hand on a child that made people scream. Demand action. People called for nets and for traps and for a public hunting license to be issued. I tried to mediate. I argued at town meetings and in the sheriff's office. I made legal statements and kept evidence like the casts and the notes. Dr. Lena Ortiz said we could try to relocate the creature to a wildlife refuge where it could not be harmed. I knew that relocation would be tantamount to exile. I also knew that leaving it here would risk more poison and bullets. The moral calculus felt like walking a rope. The trial of wills culminated when a group of men led by Roy and supported by some locals set out to corner the creature near the old quarry. I learned of their plan and had to make a choice: stand with them and watch, try to stop them physically, or try to hide the creature. I chose to hide it. I staged fake tracks that led away. I fed the creature at an isolated gorge, and I lied in statements at inquest hearings when asked where I had last seen it. Miguel warned me that I could be charged for obstruction of justice. Bill said, "Daniel, you have a family to protect." But Emily had already seen the creature with her own eyes, and the idea of jail meant less than not protecting a life I had vowed to watch. The night of the quarry attack, the men came with dogs and light and rage. Shots were fired. The creature defended itself, and in the melee, a young hunter called Sam fell and later died from his wounds. The town was in flames of accusation. I was arrested and released on bail, and in the press, I became either a saint or a monster. In court, there were long procedural descriptions of tracking, of ballistics, of legal codes, and of the rights of property owners. The courtroom smelled of varnish and old paper. Dr. Lena Ortiz testified about the anomalies in the footprints and the casts. She explained, in terms that were careful and methodical, that the prints had a bipodal rate distribution consistent with a primate morphology, and that there were matrix differences in the soil that suggested a gait not commonly recorded in known fauna. Her testimony was clear, and within a paragraph of 300 characters, she said, "The casts show interdigital spacing and pressure distribution patterns indicating a species adapted to both arboreal and terrestrial locomotion, which would account for the alternating quadrupedal and bipedal tracks we observed." The legal system moved slowly, and the creature vanished into the old growth at the edge of human memory, while the town argued. The aftermath left me with scars of another kind: guilt, a loss of trust, and the knowledge that secrecy had both saved and endangered lives. In the months following the trial, I had 3 epilogues to this story that I note in time because they are the kinds of measures by which one can see the slow healing of a place. 1 month after the last hearing, I returned to the clearing where I had first seen its prints. The air smelled of lemongrass and wet cedar. There were no fresh prints, but there were small disturbances in the underbrush where it had rested. The townspeople had placed a memorial near the quarry for Sam. I left a small carved wooden button I had saved, and when I returned, the button was gone. 3 months later, the children playing near the creek no longer reported strange calls at dusk, and some farmers said their flocks had fewer nighttime losses. I walked the boundaries with Miguel, and we sealed a few illegal paths and taught new volunteer rangers how to watch without disturbing. The town was quieter, though the old arguments sometimes surfaced at council meetings. 6 months after the incident, Emily found, under an old willow root, a bundle of woven grass containing a pebble necklace she had once lost and a scrap of cloth that smelled like our house. She brought it to me with the expression of someone who had found both an answer and a question. I kept the bundle on a shelf, and sometimes at dawn I would leave an apple on the porch and come back to find the core gone. The ritual endured. In the end, my conclusion is difficult and deliberate. I protected what I could while understanding that protection sometimes requires deception. I made choices that some judge and others accept. I will not tell you that every decision was pure or that there was no cost. I promised the creature something I could not legally keep: discretion and continuance. I fulfilled what I could in secret and what I could in daylight by fighting for stricter regulation on hunting and for the opening of a small conservation fund that Dr. Lena Ortiz helped negotiate so that the forest would be monitored and the habitat restored. If you are sitting there feeling shock or anger or sympathy, that is what it should do to you. I want you to join a conversation now, because stories like this do not live in isolation. Have you ever witnessed something in nature that made you change a long-held belief? Have you had to choose between what is legal and what is kind? Leave a comment below with the first line telling where you were and what season it was, and if you felt fear or wonder. Tell us if you ever protected something others wanted to expose, and if you did, what happened next. Your comments help map a community response to these situations and guide whether future investigations are shared widely or kept private to protect lives. I read them, and they have informed how we will handle other cases. Now, before I close, there are a few practical things I did that I must document, because without method, we fall. Superstition. I kept photographic evidence with timestamps. I recorded vocalizations using a directional microphone and archived them with metadata. I documented all offerings and tokens with notes on location and condition, and I filed medical reports when people or animals were injured. These procedural details matter because they built a bridge between feeling and study. In the end, my final act was simple and symbolic. On a cold morning, I walked to the old willow with a bag of apples. I left 3 on an exposed root, and I sat in the damp grass and listened. A breeze cut through like a blade, and then nothing for a long time. When I came back at noon, the apples were gone, and there was a single pebble on the root where one had been. I promised, softly, to keep feeding in secret, to keep the records, and to fight for laws that did not punitively exile the unknown. If you want to follow what comes next and help keep these stories researched with dignity and care, subscribe to this channel. By subscribing, you support careful investigation that values life over spectacle, and you join a community that chooses protection before exposure. My last words are small and necessary. Some secrets are not meant to be solved. They are meant to be kept with care.